Hello everyone, this is Murray Rundis. I've been attacked. Okay, well, it's actually not that big of a deal. But at the end of this video, I will be making a public challenge to a formal debate. Some background about what has been going on. There was some big news in that the great English convert and scholar and writer in the Victorian period, St. John Henry Newman, was elevated to the level of Doctor of the Church. This is a big deal for many people, especially for us converts who came to the faith in the English-speaking world and had some of his books as our introductions to Catholicism. And many of us, including myself, read St. John Henry Newman's work, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua. That led many people, but again, including myself, to a more traditional understanding of Catholicism. He's a prolific writer. He's one that requires a lot of understanding and in-depth reading, but he really is the doctor of the modern church. This is something I was quite pleased with. Now, predictably, this is going to be used as a sort of tool by liberals. And we'll get more into that soon. Recently, there's also been a traditionalist concern over John Henry Newman's writings, saying that it could lead to a destruction of the church's doctrine. And there was one article in particular that caught my eye. It was one that had featured a image of John Henry Newman with an LGBT flag, a stole, wrapped around him, and he had two Francis papacy documents. Now, this was very offensive to me because I have to deal with constantly seeing and talking with liberals who claim that John Henry Newman was a homosexual because he had very close Victorian friendships. Certainly were not homosexual relations. And look, I'm against AI-generated images as it is. I've used them in the past, but I've stopped because one of my main concerns is that if you're not able to put your own artistic ability, pen to paper, or paintbrush to paper, or whatever it is, it can degrade the level of which what you're creating is authentic. And I no longer use these even for thumbnails or for our paper over at CFN, not only because I just think they look stupid and they look unintelligent, but it also allows people to create things without much thought at all. And in this case, the author of the article and the producer of the image, Chris Jackson, has said that the purpose of the image was to show how the Vatican will make Newman out to be. A quick side note, I don't even think we should do that in creating this connection between sodomy and saints. For example, if we did this with St. Francis of Assisi, we depicted him as a drag queen using AI imagery. I think that is sacrilegious. It shouldn't be done. And it really does take away from God's glory that he has in his saints. So it's something that I found repulsive as it was. Now, Chris Jackson is a writer that I actually respect. He's been in the traditional Catholic world for a long time, and I've actually read and even cited many of his articles that he's written in the past, and I respect him for that. But due to the sacrilegious nature of the image, which again, even if it's trying to make a point, I don't think we should make this kind of image, even if it's satire or something like this, but also the content of the article, which critiques Newman from a number of perspectives, and I'll get into that in a moment. But because of these things, I felt the need to correct him on Twitter. I don't want this circling around with Newman with an LGBT stole on him. And I also think there are some troubling ideas in the article itself. Now, after I shared this, after I shared my concerns and about the substance of the article, some of which I think was concocted by artificial intelligence, in response I was told that I was being overly emotional, that I was not engaging with the so-called traditionalist critiques of Newman, and I'm only doing this because I don't like him because he didn't like one of the many people I've interviewed in my career. After that, I was blocked. Behind my blocked back, I was then targeted in a hit piece, which said that I'm a member of Trad Inc., which I'll get to in a moment, but also that I am not willing to critique Leo XIV or the Francis documents, Traditionis Custodes, Fiducia Supplicans, Nemoris Laetitia, which is hilarious because I critique these things every week over on CFN. I have many hours with many thousands of views, many more than Chris Jackson's articles get, that have been discussing these issues in depth, looking at the documents, but apparently I am silent on Pope Leo XIV. He says this about my silence: "These very items have received no meaningful critique from Rundus concerning Leo XIV, who endorses Francis wholeheartedly and allows diocesan priests and bishops to celebrate openly LGBTQ affirming masses, rainbow stole and all. One would think these developments would concern Rundus deeply, yet silence reigns supreme." They do trouble me, and I am frequently on Catholic Family News talking about my concerns about these things. It's really just an absurd jab there. It doesn't make any sense. But the author of the article did change the image. He now has Leo's Newman on the top of the image, but that really doesn't get around my critique of the image, which I think is just AI-generated slop. My critique about if you had Leo's Francis, which is ridiculous. If you had Francis of Assisi in a drag queen outfit, I wouldn't be affirming of that. I think that would be ridiculous. I don't think that's something that art should be used for, even if satirically. But it also doesn't get to my concerns about the substance of the article, which were never addressed. Something I asked the author in the preceding X thread was a very simple question. Have you ever read a complete work by John Henry Newman? Now, I never received a response for this, but you'd think this is something very easy to answer, right? I said, list the book and list the publishing house. All you would have to do is pick up a book by John Henry Newman that you've read, and I didn't even need to see notes or anything like that. I just asked for the book, the name of the book, and then the publishing house to show that he actually has the book. He didn't want to do it. And the reason why is because it's very evident from the article that he's never read John Henry Newman. And again, my concern is that if you raise a concern or a criticism, which he has doubled down on, that these are criticisms of Newman, if you raise criticisms of a certain thinker, a holy thinker, mind you, if you raise those concerns, you should have at least read the author himself. You should be acquainted with the ideas. If not, you're just uninformed. What you have to say has no bearing on anything. It's one thing if you're trying to show, well, this is going to be used as a tool, but again, the article is making out criticisms of Newman, which is my problem. It's like that one Nietzsche meme, I don't know if you've seen it, where somebody says, Nietzsche talks about this, and the reply is, Nietzsche doesn't say this anywhere. Have you even read his books? And somebody says, no, have you? And the answer is no. What we have is the blind leading the blind leading the blind. Nobody knows what Newman said. Everybody is critiquing other people who haven't read Newman. No one's read Newman. Everybody loses. But this is ridiculous. We can't stand for it. Now, I would have engaged with these critiques just on Twitter had I not been promptly blocked, but I was blocked, and now this article has come out defaming my character, and so I do think it's necessary that I defend, most importantly, Newman's character from these ridiculous critiques which have no substance. And I want to do this for really 3 different reasons. Number 1, so that traditional Catholics can claim Newman and his wide span of works as our own. Newman is a traditional Catholic, and it's something we should be rejoicing in that the Church is embracing him. Number 2, to encourage intellectual development and research in the traditional Catholic movement and discourage a rash judgment of things that we haven't even read. If we become known as a movement that we critique things without even having any sort of knowledge, that we get all of our information from artificial intelligence, this movement's not going to go anywhere. So we can't stand by that. And number 3, to prevent false conceptions of Newman resulting from people misunderstanding him. So let's jump into it. Now, this is the section of the article that I take issue with. Again, I don't really have any concerns about somebody saying Newman's going to be used by the post-conciliar church to justify modernism. If somebody wants to raise those concerns, I understand it. I also agree with, in many of the cases, some of the troubling things we've seen, especially in the Francis papacy, but also in the Leonine papacy. But this section right here is what I have a big issue with, and it's a large section. Now, I'll also put on the screen that it does seem from the resources that I've used that this part is largely generated by artificial intelligence. I don't see how this could not be generated by artificial intelligence, but perhaps we'll give Chris Jackson the benefit of the doubt and say that he actually did write this section. Regardless, I have major issues with it. Let's begin. Traditional Catholics have long been uneasy about Newman's most famous idea, his theory of the development of doctrine. Well, so off the bat, which traditional Catholics have been uneasy about Newman? That's a big assertion, because then now we're claiming that the movement and intelligent figures have been raising legitimate concerns, citing the text, and raising concerns about Newman. Well, who has? Michael Davies wrote a book in support of Newman. Archbishop Lefebvre and his SSPX, they've published articles defending Newman's conception of the development of Christian doctrine. Did Dietrich von Hildebrand oppose Newman? Certainly not. I cannot think of one prominent traditionalist figure in the church who has opposed Newman or been uneasy about his theory of the development of doctrine. This might seem like a small issue. It's not, because I claim no, traditional Catholics have been embracing Newman, and that his development of Christian doctrine, not even just a theory, it's called a theory as if this is some, just random conception that he's come up with on speculative grounds. Look, I think Newman's development of doctrine is almost a necessary part of believing Catholic doctrine. But again, regardless of that, there is no major traditional Catholic source that has been critical of Newman's idea. It's certainly not looking at the text. Again, maybe interpretations, but I cannot think of one. Now then he says, well, not heretical per se. I hate that. I hate when we say it's not heretical per se, because what is it per then? Is it heretical per accidens? Per quod? Per se. That's almost implying that it's heretical in a different way, just not in and of itself. It's ambiguously heretical. What do we mean it's not heretical per se? It's good. The development of Christian doctrine is good. It's something that, and he even cites this down here. Pope St. Pius X endorsing a defense of him, of Newman. Well, I mean, what do we mean it's heretical per se? It completely goes against that spirit. It's a good thing. It opens the door, he says, intentionally or not, to everything the church now suffers under: ambiguity, innovation, and the false legitimacy of theological drift. It would be good if he cited the development of Christian doctrine, this book here, which I don't think he's read. This one right here. The development of Christian doctrine, if he cited it saying, here are the issues I have problems with, or that even that other people have had problems with, that would be one thing. He doesn't do that here. I really don't think there are problems that open the door to those sorts of things. Just unless you take an idea that everything in church history has been believed in the exact same way for all time, that's the only way you could maintain an attack on Newman in this sort of way. It's impossible to do. And Newman relates a number of points. If you read the actual book itself, he relates a number of points where he firstly lays out a number of examples about this. One of the examples, it really couldn't be used by the post-conciliarists because it's talking about the development of the church going around communion of one kind. So not in both kinds, but actually the norm of the church is to distribute communion under one species. Well, he shows that this is something that wasn't always done in the early church. But there's been a development, and we have to see that development, because of the rule of the church, it's not a speculation, but because of the authority of the church, this has become something trustworthy of belief. There's many other examples he gives, even baptism of infants. This is something that should be obvious to anybody who's read any early church father, where people used to put off their baptism until late in life, right before death. Of course, the church had a development, an increase in understanding, right? When we say development, we mean an increase. So we're increasing our fervor, we're increasing our actual understanding of what was implicitly contained in Revelation, which Newman says. Newman doesn't say they're creating new revelation or creating a new deposit of the faith. We're not saying development from one to another. He's saying what is implicitly contained in the deposit of faith, we have an increase in understanding, a development of understanding. And so in the baptism of infants, we have an increase in understanding of original sin, of the baptism of what baptism actually does, and that leads to a development saying that infants need to be baptized, and this becomes a universal practice. So I really don't think, it would be nice if we had some kind of citation, but again, it doesn't exist here. Now, again, this is the quote. These dots I don't like. I've never seen somebody really use these sort of dots without using artificial intelligence, but again, I'm giving them the benefit of the doubt. This section, traditionalist concerns include, among who? Who's making those concerns? Never seen one. Unless you're talking about, Tradcat Crusader 1488 on Twitter, I really don't see really prominent people in the traditional Catholic movement making criticisms of Newman like this. Relativism cloaked as development. Newman's idea that doctrine unfolds organically through history can be twisted to justify contradictory teachings, as long as they're rebranded as deeper insights. Now again, you could take that in the sense of, well, this is just how people have misinterpreted Newman. But he says, Newman's idea that doctrine unfolds organically or organically through history. I have a bit of a problem with some of the terminology there, and we'll see this in another point, where it almost makes it seem like Newman is a Hegelian, where history is through synthesis, through a dialectical process, is coming to a greater understanding. That's not what Newman is saying. Again, he's saying what is implicitly contained in the deposit of faith, we have a development, and we have clear signs. I believe he gives 7 signs of clear, true development, as opposed to a false corruption of doctrine. But again, I don't think it's fair in any sense to say it's relativism cloaked as development. If anybody has read this book, and you can say this about any author, what if we said this about St. Thomas? I have a problem with St. Thomas's Summa Theologica because it's relativism. Okay, well, if you're going to say that, if you're going to say you have a concern about St. Thomas being a relativist, you need to cite something. You need to show why you believe that. Instead, we have what is likely an artificial conception of what Newman believed, when in reality he didn't believe anything like this. Now, he then says, undermining doctrinal stability. The emphasis on historical process over fixed content risks making the magisterium appear as a moving target, something mutable, rather than a guardian of the deposit of the faith. Well, that's the opposite of what Newman said, because we're talking about the deposit of the faith, right? Now, he's also saying, again, the emphasis on historical process, that's a Hegelian idea. It's certainly not something that Newman is adopting. Newman is not a German idealist by any stretch of the imagination. You might say he's more of an idealist than perhaps a British analytical thinker, but he's not a German idealist in the strict sense, and he's not a Hegelian looking at historical processes, and he certainly does say there's fixed content. Again, what is the alternative to Newman's development of doctrine? That everything we explicitly believe now has always been explicitly believed? You run into a contradiction. That's going to have to be explained by Chris Jackson if he wants to defend this sort of point. What alternative to Newman's conception of the development of doctrine, and the fathers mention development of doctrine too, mind you, what's the alternative? That we simply make up that what is explicitly believed now has always been explicitly believed? You can't do it. You're not going to be able to find the strict formulations of Vatican I, for example, in the early church in the same way. It's implicitly there. It's not explicitly always. Same thing when it comes to many doctrines of the faith. Newman spends a long time, because he's a scholar of the 4th century, right? He spends a long time talking about the development of Christology. Our current understanding of Christology, you simply cannot find in toto looking at St. Cyril of Jerusalem, for example. His Christology is not completely explicitly how we would conceive of it now. It's implicitly, I think, in St. Cyril of Jerusalem, but it's not entirely there. What's the alternative to the development of Christian doctrine? Nobody gives it. If you're a traditionalist critiquing the development of Christian doctrine, give an alternative. There is none. He goes on. This is the worst part. It's really embarrassing. The illative sense problem. I must say, I've never heard this pronounced. I could be pronouncing that wrong. I'll admit that. I've only seen that in text. I've never heard somebody say the illative sense. Newman's reliance on intuition and experience as routes to theological certainty, his so-called illative sense, has been criticized as being overly subjective, inviting spiritualized guesswork rather than objective truth. That's completely wrong. And the challenge I would give, and if Chris Jackson's watching this, maybe he can try to figure it out when I ask this question. Where does he talk about the illative sense? What book? We'll give somebody a moment. Well, it's actually this book, The Grammar of Assent. This is a difficult work. If you've ever read Newman, don't start here. This is a first edition copy, actually, that I was glad to get. It's from the UK. Very difficult work. And again, he's dealing with, because this is a rich English tradition in philosophy, because of course Locke is writing heavily in his essay concerning human understanding. Hume is, of course, a radical skeptic, and Newman is really concerning how can we come to a knowledge, a certain knowledge of anything, because really that's what all of philosophy rests on. Because there's this big debate going on in philosophy. It's been going on for a while between skepticism and what we have on the continental philosophy side of things, like Kant. You can even look at, maybe you can even count Leibniz as being one. Newman talks about this, though, about there's this division between radical skeptics who say that you can't come to certainty, you can only come to probability. And he says, I don't agree with that. But he says there's these others, like the continental philosophers, who have categories of the mind that they sort of impose on things. And that's the way that they're able to come to certainty. So they have sense experience, and then they're able to use these categories of the mind to come to certainty. What Newman says, and the reason why this is ridiculous, and it shows there's no understanding, because Newman he talked about this ad nauseum. What Newman says is that he's not engaging on the why problem. He's not engaging on the why we can come to certainty, or even the sort of how. He's simply talking about the practical experience. The reason why he does that is because St. Thomas has a clear understanding of certainty, where one is abstracting knowledge from the things themselves. Again, this is deep philosophy stuff. This is hylomorphism and all that stuff, right? A moderate realism. So Newman isn't engaging on that. He's simply saying, how can we practically come to certainty on things? It's not spiritualized guesswork. I don't know what that even means. What are we saying? An objective truth? The whole point is that you're coming to objective truth. That's the point of the grammar of assent. That's the whole point of the work. The whole point is, how do we come to a certainty of a truth around us? Newman is not a subjectivist. Newman is not even like an existentialist. What Newman is very practically saying is that we draw from many different sources, and we do have a sort of intuition that unites our experiences together and leads us to a certainty of things. And he talks about how you need, not spiritualized guesswork, but you need outside authorities to be able to guide you on these sort of matters. And that's just a practical experience. Again, we're not talking about, and this is it's such a complicated problem. This is why I suggest, if you've not read the Grammar of Assent, or if you've not, read these works, don't be making critiques of them, because then you're going to have no understanding. You're going to look like a complete clown. And so he's not engaging on the speculative Kant's categories. He's not engaging on Hume's skepticism. He's engaging on how do we practically come to certainty. So I will say this paragraph means nothing. It has no understanding of the Grammar of Assent. None. And it's a huge problem, because if we did take it as this, if that was our understanding of Newman, we can throw it out. When in reality, this is one of the most important works that has been written. One of the most important, period. Especially in the English language. Liturgy and novelty. His theory has rightly or wrongly been invoked to support liturgical reform and post-conciliar novelty. That's probably true, but it's just wrongly. It's not rightly. Whether Newman would have endorsed the Novus Ordo is besides the point. His ideas are used to justify it. Well, I really do disagree with that, mainly because Newman doesn't. Again, we're saying his theory. This is probably being taken as the development of doctrine. His theory of development of doctrine. He's always talking about an organic development. And when you look at the Novus Ordo, it certainly is not an organic development. It's a creation of a new rite. Newman doesn't really address liturgical matters as much. Again, he mentions some of those sacramental issues. He mentions some of the rituals. You can count communion on one kind, I suppose, as being a sort of liturgical testimony. But I don't think that this is not a serious concern. It's certainly not something to justify, which many of the commenters are taking it as. We need to throw Newman out. He's too dangerous. Maybe Chris Jackson doesn't get it, but the way this is phrased is, Newman's dangerous. He's not a modernist, but he probably would be if it was today. And that's why he gets into the next sentence. He says, even so, it would be unjust to claim that Newman was a modernist. Agreed, completely unjust. He lived before the movement was fully formed. Right, so as if Newman would be a modernist if the movement was fully formed. What is that? Why is that there? Again, can you imagine if we said that about St. Thomas? St. Thomas wasn't a modernist. The modernist movement wasn't around yet. I get, just as Chris Jackson would critique the Pope splainers for saying that, the Pope getting around with technicalities, you can't get around that. That sentence is you talk about an ambiguity. It's right there. You're making it sound like he would be a modernist if it was today. And yet here, and again, I'm glad he mentioned this. I don't think he's read this work, Bishop O'Dwyer's Defense of Newman. It's very popular among sedevacantist thinkers who I think disagree with Chris Jackson on these points. They quote this text a lot too, and good for them. That's great, because this is a great text. He calling him a Catholic to the tips of his fingers. That's true. And yet here lies the danger. Newman's ambiguous formulations and lack of scholastic precision make him a perfect Trojan horse. Newman's ambiguous formulations? What is ambiguous? That's a criticism I can't imagine laying on Newman. This is one of the most precise works that's ever been written. The Development of Christian Doctrine. This is more precise than Chris Jackson is capable of writing in his entire life. One page of that is more precise than any traditionalist author is capable of writing in their entire lives. It's completely ridiculous to say it's ambiguous, as if he sort of just cobbled this together. This is a masterpiece. Ridiculous. Lack of scholastic precision. He's more precise than any writer likely in the past 200 years. Let's not call him a Trojan horse, okay? There's just no, unless you have read one book by Newman, you shouldn't be able to make these criticisms. He has said just enough to be co-opted by modernists, but not enough to be definitively condemned by tradition. As if he would be condemned undefinitively, or we can sort of say, oh, you're getting close there, John Henry. You're getting close. We can't definitively give you the anathema. What are we doing? Then it contradicts. Again, there's sort of two sort of competing ways of thought. As a result, he is now weaponized by the very theologians who would have horrified him in life. Maybe that's true. I think he would be horrified by many of the things he's seen today. So again, my main concern with this article is you have to propose a realistic alternative to Newman's Development of Doctrine, which requires you read the book. You have to read Development of Christian Doctrine in order to critique it. And it shows a complete lack of understanding of the grammar of assent, no understanding of his epistemology, and a misapplication of where his Development of Christian Doctrine will actually lead. I don't think there's any understanding. There's no room to make these sort of sly statements insinuating that he could be heretical or a modernist. I think it is nonsensical. Now, as promised, I want to end this video with a very clear remark. The only way I see this as being able to be reconciled is that Chris Jackson comes out and says that he's never read a book by John Henry Newman. I asked him to list the books that he's read by John Henry Newman. I asked him to list the publishing house that that published the books by Newman that he's read. I don't think he's read a book by John Henry Newman. I'd like him to admit that, because then that discredits the entire article. And so I understand that might be embarrassing, so I'm going to give him an out. I formally challenge publicly Chris Jackson to a public debate on John Henry Newman. I will address these criticisms that you've made of John Henry Newman. I will defend Newman's honor against these criticisms, these sly criticisms, and I want to do it in public. There's a number of people that can host this debate. We have many mutual friends. I think Avoiding Babylon with Anthony and Rob, they could host this debate. Stephen Cox might be able to. I'd go on many neutral platforms. List a person, but I publicly challenge Chris Jackson to this debate. I think it's only fair if you call me Trad Inc. That's kind of a cool name. I kind of like that name, Trad Inc. I think you might be giving me too much credit here, Chris, but Trad Inc. is publicly challenging you to a debate. So maybe you can defend your thoughts about John Henry Newman publicly. Maybe you're a Newman scholar. If you're a Newman scholar, debate me. Debate me, and I will defend Newman against these criticisms. There is no room for it. So again, you block me, you talk bad about me behind my back, you call me these names behind my back, you say I'm doing this just for clout or something, clout about somebody I've interviewed. Okay, I challenge you to a debate. Will you accept it or not? Either that, or maybe this can just go away. You say, look, I didn't read Newman, I'm out of my bounds here. I would accept that too. But I publicly challenge you to a debate. So let's do it, Chris. So everyone, thanks for watching. Do tag Chris Jackson if you're on Twitter. I'm blocked by him. At Big Modernism, you can tag him. You can say that Murray Rundish challenges you to a debate, a public debate on John Henry Newman, because I think you are wrong in your criticisms that you likely didn't write. But if you did write it and AI didn't, that's completely fine. Defend them against me. Trad Inc. will defend Newman against you. So again, everyone, thanks for watching. Tag Chris Jackson. Let's make this debate happen.